Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my virtual presentation on what motivates our students to be academically successful, a research study. I am Lauren Albaum, the director of the Health Professions and STEM Career Development Center at Florida Southern College. And this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. One, because it did serve as my doctoral dissertation research, but also because I have been fascinated in our students and in why they are and are not successful in terms of acceptance to professional school. Just a little bit about me. I have been in health professions advising for the majority of my professional career, serving as director of two different offices, and have worked with both large schools and small schools. So currently at Florida Southern, I have a rather small population, but have served in a capacity where I was able to work with students where I had about 6,500 pre-health students pursuing professional school each year. We all know admissions is highly competitive and seems to continue to get more competitive each year. Over the last decade, we have seen an increase in the need for extracurricular activities, strong entrance exam scores such as the MCAT, DAT, PCAT, OAT, etc., and a high GPA, which is what we'll focus on for the remainder of the presentation. So, as this interest in professional school continues to grow, so does that competition for admission. And students then are being asked to show increased resilience and academic performance. What I found interesting is although there's quite a bit of research on motivation and persistence for medical school students or students in pharmacy school for or PA school, for example, very little research actually exists on pre-health students regarding their motivation and persistence. I set out to investigate the extent of the relationship between pre-medical and pre-veterinary medical students in terms of goal orientation and academic performance. And I'll talk a little bit about why I picked pre-medical and pre-veterinary medical, but largely it had to do with access to students. And so when I looked at academic performance, I thought, as a pre-health advisor, how will I evaluate this? And really, the biggest way in my mind to do that was through GPA. I'll talk a little bit about the challenges with GPA, but it is a factor that was easily evaluated. And then, in terms of goal orientation, my study delineated goal orientation into three orientations: mastery goal oriented, performance goal oriented, and alienation goal oriented. In looking at these questions for the research study, I mainly evaluated the idea of their academic class, so freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior, in relationship to that academic performance or GPA. Now remember, the goal of this would be to see if strides need to be made to better understand the factors influencing their academic achievement in order to identify those who may be at risk so we can provide timely interventions and resources. Many people are now saying that this is our responsibility, that if the SERP data is correct that shows students are electing to choose higher education as a means to be accepted, in the case of my research, to medical school and other health professions, then we almost have a responsibility to ensure that information is clear, consistent, and that we are finding those who may be academically at risk. One other statistic for you. In another study, 85% of students indicate their primary reason for attending college is to get a better job. And so it's not just many different administrators and those interested in public policy who are calling on us to do this. There are students and parents who are saying we have expectations about what it is we need to know and how you're going to help me get there. So again, just to reframe, this study was looking at academic performance measured by GPA in terms of the relationship to a student's goal orientation. Archer believed that every university student actually had a preference for one of three goal orientations: either mastery goal orientation, performance goal orientation, or alienation goal orientation. Now, when we break these down, the mastery goal oriented students are those that are driven to master material. They're less interested in the final grade potentially, so long as they're competent in their understanding. These students tend to be those high achieving students who are internally motivated to learn. Performance oriented students, who are fairly similar to their mastery goal oriented students, are driven to display competence. So they may also appear to be high achievers, but they are driven or motivated by other intrinsic factors. So they will seek out subject matter that they know that they are highly successful in. However, at the first sign of struggle, performance goal oriented students will tend to become avoidant, to evade negative judgments of their faculty or peers. Some may even self sabotage as a conscious choice rather than exuding effort and potentially being unsuccessful. So, again, these performance goal oriented students tend on the surface to appear to be high achieving, but it is somewhat of a self selection because they will select out of those opportunities or courses in which they are unable to appear high achieving to others. They are really and truly driven to demonstrate competence, and thus making them at a higher risk for negative effects of shame, embarrassment, and anxiety. And then alienation-oriented students, as the name would imply, they tend to alienate from anything that they find difficult or unappealing. They believe that their strengths lie outside of the classroom and thus are not interested in gaining the approval of others regarding academic performance. In other words, they are not really motivated to achieve. And we see that through putting forth minimal effort. So through this study, to be able to put forth a quantitative study that looks at GPA and motivation, each of the subjects were identified by their preference for either mastery goal orientation, performance goal orientation, and alienation oriented. You'll notice they were on the side. I did want to give credit to some of these other theories, social cognitive theories that did influence Archer, such as self-worth theory, self-efficacy theory, and control theory. And although today this is a very, very brief synopsis of the research, at the end I do leave my name and contact information, and I would be happy to address any of the theoretical framework, literature review, studies that influence this research in greater depth. And again, for the sake of time, I really am only going to highlight just a few points from the literature, many of which you may already know. A few that I found interesting is this idea of hidden curriculum, that as we know that yes, GPA is important and is a huge factor, but really it's both the academic and the additional responsibilities and requirements that have a direct impact not only on acceptance, but also on success after being accepted to professional school. What I also find interesting is, although we are acknowledging these hidden curriculum and different factors that influence, if you will, student success, little changes have been made to the admissions practices over the last decade. And finally, we do see that grades have long been used to evaluate student performance, and for especially medical school, they continue to hold substantial weight. So although a myriad of studies have evaluated the reliability of academic and non-academic attributes to predict student success and satisfaction, the research on reliability of GPA to predict success is highly mixed. So I point that out to say I acknowledge it, yet I am also using it as a very important factor in this research study. The study design utilized a 40-question Likert type survey. It was the Archer's Modified Health Professions Survey that was obviously created by Archer and then modified by Perot et al. And the intent of this survey is to identify a student's preferred goal orientation. So through taking this 40-question survey, each of the questions aligns with one of the subscales, either performance, mastery, or alienation, and each student gets a average subscale score for each of these orientations. Their highest subscale score will be their preferred subscale score. And then we looked at that preferred score, so whether they were performance-oriented, mastery-oriented, or alienation-oriented, in relationship to their fall 2019 GPA using t-test and chi-squared tests. The population included approximately 351 students at Florida Southern College who self-identified as pre-health. Of that, about 215 replied to the survey, and only about 159 were viable, meaning that they were fully complete and authorized use of their identifying information, which was voluntary. I needed that information to be able to access their GPA, but it was in compliance with the Institutional Research Board, 100% confidential unless they voluntarily provided that information, which did limit the response numbers slightly, limit the sample. Finally, that sample was further delimited to students who indicated an interest in medical and veterinary medical schools specifically. That was again based largely in a convenience sample mindset. I knew that from the larger population at my institution, of which I had accessible um, uh, of which I had access, that I had likely medical and veterinary medical students of a population that I could access. Um, Again, I also limited the responses or the sample to only those who completed at least 12 or more credits, and of which 7 credits were biochemistry, physics, or math. I wanted to control at least slightly for rigor in the coursework. Because as we know, GPA can vary highly from someone who took 6 credit hours compared to 14 credit hours, or someone who took in this case, at least 7 credits of what would be deemed traditionally competitive science coursework versus someone who took much less science coursework. And unfortunately, a preference score was undiscernible for one student, which left me with a final data set of 99 responses. Just briefly, I will acknowledge again that these were students at Florida Southern College who self-identified as pre-health. To my office, the Health Professions and STEM Career Development Center, I do keep robust records every year. Students will, across campus, will report if they are a pre-health student, or if they self-identify as pre-health, they will do this at least 2 times per year. So we do have fairly robust records to go off of to create this convenient sample. They did receive an email invitation sent on behalf of the researcher, that was myself, and we used Qualtrics, and they had 4 weeks to complete the online survey. And now here's where we get some interesting and some limited data. So first of all, we found that of those goal orientations, again, as a reminder, this study looked to evaluate students' GPA in relationship to goal orientation, with goal orientation preferences being either mastery, performance, or alienation. Again, remember, mastery generally being those students who look to master material. They're high achieving, but they do so because they would like to best understand content. Performance goal oriented, also appearing generally as high achieving students, but more driven or motivated by wanting to appear competent to peers and faculty. And alienation goal oriented, they just are unmotivated by academics or looking competent in an academic setting. So interesting here, for this population of 99, or the sample, excuse me, of 99 participants, it was almost a even split between mastery goal orientation and performance goal orientation, with only one person actually having a preference for alienation goal orientation. As I'll discuss later, I do believe that there is additional research needed into this delineation, as the mean subscales actually between mastery goal orientation and performance goal orientation were very, very close. So there's question as to whether there is even a delineation at all between students who are mastery goal oriented and performance goal oriented. If a subscale score on the survey for mastery goal orientation was, for example, a 4.2, and their performance goal orientation subscale score was a 4.1, they still were listed as mastery goal orientation. But is that really accurate? Or do we, at this point, just have a hybrid of students who are pre-health that are a combination of mastery and goal orientation? I don't know. To me, very, very interesting. One, interesting that they have such a split, that there's not a kind of clear mastery goal orientation for pre-health students or performance goal orientation, but that there really is quite a split there going down the line. And it does need some further explanation. Additionally, and unfortunately, there was no statistically significant relationship between grade point average and a student's preferred goal orientation. And actually, I should take that back. I should take back the word unfortunately, because there's still quite a lot that we learn from this, even with no statistical significance. whether that's between grade point average and goal orientation or not. So, for example, again, what I said on the last slide about how it is very interesting that the students seem to be evenly split between the two, it is definitely worth noting that overall there's a lack of alienation goal orientation preference. Again, 98.99% of our students reported, or the students in this sample reported as performance goal oriented or mastery goal oriented. But also, so what does that mean for our students if they're all coming in this, whether it be because they're motivated by doing well or whether they are motivated by appearing to be competent, they are still largely coming across as this high achieving group. And I will just note, although it wasn't statistically significant, that one alienation goal oriented student did have the lowest grade point average of any other student within their cohort, within their sophomore cohort. And so also when we look through this, there were, again, in the freshman cohort, which I thought was interesting, there were 2 times as many students who were mastery goal oriented compared to performance goal oriented. And that is a little bit interesting and somewhat negates some of the research, right? Because you would assume that freshman students would come in possibly exhibiting, and not just assume, there was research that backs that up, that says that freshman students come in with a performance goal orientation, right? They have been coached, if you will, to appear to be high achieving. They have always been, many of them, the valedictorians and salutatorians and honor council students, and they have been driven to seek that reflection of themselves in the eyes of their peers, their parents, their faculty as the smartest and strongest. Yet in this study, the freshmen were actually appearing as mastery oriented, those students who would largely be driven just by knowledge. And although they tend to be high achieving, they actually, maybe are not driven by just the grade itself. So I thought that was very interesting and also would need some further explanation or further research. And I just can't not hit on this again, but that lack of variation in the goal orientation preference in those mean subscale scores. So again, I've broken that down for you on the slide. For each, in that Likert scale that I used, survey, they did have a subscale score for performance orientation, mastery orientation, and alienation orientation. And again, their highest mean score was what we used to what I used to determine their preference. But it was, there was just very little variation in that. There was also very little variation in their goal orientation and their GPA. So if you look at that over on the right hand side, it almost leads you to wonder if our students are really that different, or maybe our pre-health students in general, our pre-meds and pre-vets, are just extremely cohesive in their motivations, in their GPAs in general. And then I'll just briefly acknowledge some of these limitations. Again, the sample was limited to one very small private school, and the sample was small. Also, the pre-med and pre-vet students do not adhere to one set curriculum. So, one student, although I did account for them needing to be in at least 7 credits of biology, chemistry, physics, or math, their schedules could still vary greatly and have different degrees of difficulty. There was no control for external factors, and some of those first year students may not yet have exhibited academic performance problems. So kind of going back to that finding about them being mastery oriented, with those kind of, fairly decent GPAs, that could be potentially due to the fact that they have not yet been exhibited. Additionally, we did see quite a large attrition rate of students who self-identified as pre-health as we went from freshman through to senior year. So that further may have skewed the sample sizes between classifications. And then there's some kind of important ones that I want to highlight: competition or response bias. So again, these are highly competitive students to begin with. And so they may be answering the survey with response bias, right? If I'm asking them to answer questions in relationship to how long they study or what motivates them, there may be some skewed results in the fact that they may be answering the way that we want them to answer due to competition. And then again, just labeling participants by one singular goal orientation, I think really needs to be explored because it is a simplification of the data and does not account for some of that variance. I think it's interesting that they largely identify with only two of the three, but is a new category needed of goal orientation for pre-health students? Have we moved in such a direction that students are no longer really driven by just feedback from faculty and peers and their perception, or just driven largely by in being, knowledge for knowledge's sake, if you will. But maybe really, is there a combination between the two that needs to be looked at? And then again, we have so many students coming in with accelerated credits now that although I did the traditional classification system for freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior, there may have been quite a lot of students who were really first semester students that were counted as sophomores or possibly even juniors, thus kind of skewing how we look at students and their motivation over time. And finally, some implications for practice. So you've heard me talk about the recognition of the homogeneity of the mastery and performance goal orientation preferences. But I think this is important to note because, quite frankly, it's showing that pre-health students are coming to college with that alienation orientation already weeded out. So those, seeing very few, if only really one, sophomore alienation student kind of shows that they have theoretically maybe been weeded out in their high school courses, or they have shown that they're just not willing to exert that much effort. We know they're all now mastery and performance oriented, but what does that mean in terms of how we support them? They're still not making it. So, in one hand, more research is needed on how likely those students are to perceive and obtain acceptance, and possibly the challenge of them, maybe are they overemphasizing their competence? Are they going to fall subject to shiny star syndrome, where they have always been strong, especially those performance oriented students, but are they at risk of attrition because they are unable to be perceived as strongly moving forward through rigorous science courses? There's just some things we want to think about there. And so understanding this need to support them, it really becomes our job then as academic advisors, faculty, career counselors, and administrators to understand ways that we can positively influence academic performance and or goal orientation. And some ways that I have researched and I have looked into here include providing clear and constructive performance feedback. So, for example, Locke and Bryan show that when students are provided feedback, or individuals, on their performance, that performance improves. So when we have the proper knowledge on how to attain goals, we're able to be more successful. And feedback allows these individuals to recognize when they're below target, and hopefully how they can increase their efforts or try a new strategy if necessary. And then for many of our students, we may want to explore their goal commitment. Is this their goal? Is it their parents' dream? Do they want it simply for financial stability, which we know has influenced quite a lot of students, as many of them grew up in the recession? But we also know that goal attainment can be inhibited due to a lack of personal goal commitment. So we need to start looking at this student commitment while also encouraging self-efficacy to help them reach those goals, because as research from Locke and Latham shows, that those students who have improved self-efficacy are more successful. And we can do that through persuasive, positive communication, or that's one way we can. We want to particularly inspire or create inspiring messages that express confidence in their abilities. And by doing that, they can raise that self efficacy level and their feelings of self worth to therefore enhance that goal commitment. Finally, many students, both at the pre-health level and in professional school, are reporting feeling academically unprepared for the rigor of professional school. And so we want to be sure that we're not only preparing students with strong self-directed study habits, but that we're also emphasizing wellness. There's research that shows that students who've exercised and have stable sleep patterns, who have a strong social network, do perform better academically as undergrads and in professional school, especially as we navigate things like pandemics and the weight of social justice issues that are plaguing society. We must be very cognizant of how these may play and weigh on our pre-health students who are already under such extreme stress. So how can we as administrators help to encourage that wellness and that self-care? I know this was a very quick presentation, but I do hope that this has provided some context to our students in terms of goal orientation and academic performance. I would love to further the conversation with anyone who's interested, but for now, I will leave you with references, and on the last slide, I will be open to some questions. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you so much.